Number one, immediately start having discussions with the Department of Education about how we view, right, fitness as a nation, as not just as a national security thing, but look at the reduced cost of medical care if we just teach people how to eat and exercise appropriately as part of our development in our education system. Numero uno. If we took the occupational health assessments that the Department of Labor puts out, right, to keep businesses from having a bunch of insurance claims, right, and keep them safe and not harming humans in their workspaces, apply those things in society, then the quality goes up.
Guys, welcome back to another week here with Drew and Alex on the Mops and Mo's podcast. I'm going to tell you that when we recorded this episode, we use Zoom to do these things. And when someone joins the call, you sort of get the alert on the top. And for this particular guest, the alert that popped up was the Pentagon Briefing Room is in the waiting room, which I don't know how many people out there have done podcasts with people sitting in the Pentagon Briefing Room, but that's an incredibly intimidating thing to have pop up on your computer. Luckily, the two of us are very experienced podcasters.
Drew didn't freak out at all. He didn't mess up and click the wrong buttons or anything.
It was totally cool. Didn't expect that when we started this podcast many moons ago, but here we are. Nonetheless, this week we are talking to the Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, the SEAC. And I'm going to turn it over to you to explain what that is and who this is.
Yeah, so our guest is the fifth SEAC. It is a relatively new position. It is it literally is the senior non-commissioned officer for the entire United States military. They are the NCO partner to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, making them essentially kind of the sergeant major of all of the branches, effectively. Our guest is SEAC Troy Black. He assumed his post as the fifth SEAC on November 3rd of last year, following his selection and service as the 19th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. He's a native of Louisville, Kentucky, attended recruit training at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Parris Island. That was in April of 1988 when he went to boot camp. And he attended the School of Infantry and the Marine Corps Security Force School. I'm going to do a heavily abridged version of his bio. If you want the full bio, it's on the Joint Chiefs of Staff page. He's done a lot of things, so I'm going to have to compress this pretty far. And even the compressed version has a lot of stuff in here. We'll just do major positions he held and major operations he deployed in support of. He has been assigned as machine gunner, machine gun squad and section leader, weapon platoon sergeant, weapon platoon commander, drill instructor, senior drill instructor, school instructor, fleet anti-terrorism security team platoon sergeant and operations chief, series gunnery sergeant, RTR drill master, first sergeant, and then sergeant major at a bunch of different echelons to include 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, Combat Logistics Battalion 5, 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, 1st Marine Logistics Group, and Manpower and Reserve Affairs. Additionally, his deployments, he is deployed in support of Operation Just Cause, Operation Sea Soldier, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, Sea Angel, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Bright Star, another one to Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, Westpac 14.2, and Operation Inherent Resolve. I'm not going to do all his awards because you can guess with all those positions and all those operations, there's a bunch of them. He has a Bachelor of Science in Terrorism and Counterterrorism Studies from National American University, and he is a graduate of the Joint Special Operations Forces Senior Enlisted Academy.
That was the abridged version.
Yes, that's about half as long as his full bio.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly said this before when we have high-ranking and or lofty guests on the podcast, just the perspective that they can bring. And I think we mentioned this in the outro too. But the perspective that they can bring to a lot of the things that you and I just kind of chat with other guests about is always enlightening. And a lot of things come up in this conversation. I'm sure you can understand how some of the things that we ask him, we can't go like super deep or get super critical about for obvious reasons. We didn't want to put anybody on the spot, but I will commend the SEAC one for coming on and talking to the two of us goons, but then two, being incredibly open and transparent insofar as he's able to with a lot of the things that we talked about. So I would probably file this away as like probably one of our top 3 most interesting episodes, maybe safely.
Definitely a top episode. I will insert into here as well. This is both the reason why we brought him on, and it connects to some stuff we've been talking about recently. Those of you who follow the Instagram page, or there was also some discussion on LinkedIn, we did a blog about the concept of buy-in and how it doesn't totally apply in an environment where money's not changing hands. So it's a little bit of a weird thing to look for from service members participating in human performance programs. But where buy-in is absolutely relevant is large organizations across the DoD, service level, DoD level, are buying into human performance. And I mean that in a literal sense, putting a lot of money towards embedded human performance programs across the services. And you can see the emphasis on that and the willingness to invest from the SEAC in this conversation. And really the reason I first reached out to his staff and tried to get him on here is because the widely publicized congressional quality of life hearing happened several months back. And most of the senior enlisted leaders that were there talked about the big things that have been in the news a lot: barracks, food, pay, all those kinds of things. And the SEAC did address those things, but he on his own brought human performance into the conversation and the role of human performance programs in addressing quality of life issues, recruiting issues, all of these things. So it's clearly a priority for him, and you'll hear that throughout this episode.
So without further ado, please enjoy this fireside chat with the Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're good to go.
Awesome. Over to you guys. Good to see you, by the way. Nice to meet you. Thanks.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
So I guess we can probably start with why we were interested in having you on. And I'll tell you, for me at least, it stems from a strategy document I saw published by your office. And number 2 on that strategy document was holistic human performance. And then, like, following up on that, I watched the congressional quality of life testimony. And while everybody else focused on kind of what the hot button issues of that particular session were, barracks, pay, things like that, you kind of independently brought up total force fitness, embedded human performance, those kinds of things. And it seems like you have taken this on as like a personal priority while you're SEAC. And I'm curious about where that desire came from and what you're looking to do while you're in the seat.
Bit of a journey, but you guys can imagine, right? So a couple of things. There's going to be a little bit of recruiting, a little bit of retention kind of in this conversation. But really, I look, war fighting, national defense is a human endeavor, right? Technologies, the character of war is going to continue to evolve. I was in a meeting this morning where we're talking about the changing character of war, right? We had guys throwing rocks at each other, and then we had people shooting arrows at each other. Then, there's ships and there's planes and there's bombs. At the end of the day, it's still, the human being is still the same, right? How we determine we're going to shoot at each other might change, and how we're going to do that may change, or why wars occur change, but ultimately they're human endeavors. Unfortunately, it's not my observation. It's just through learning. We will focus our resources on the technology and the things, and we will not negotiate. For instance, if we're going to buy a new aircraft, you're going to buy it. You're going to buy it for 30 years. There's going to be a program. If you miss one step in the maintenance process, or have the parts on time process, or don't fix the fuels right, or don't update the system, like the warranty's bad and the plane doesn't fly, there's no negotiation. But the person flying it, fixing it, arming it, fueling it, there's a bunch of stuff you can do if you want to. Eat right, get some sleep, don't smoke, don't drink, exercise. And we have all these programs for you. But if you do or don't do those things, all good. Just make sure you're at work. Every step in the plane's maintenance is taken care of. It gets flown appropriately. But not so much do we think of the humans in that the same way. Now, I don't want to say that humans and machines are the same thing, but the fact of the matter is we probably need to be a little bit more stringent in how we manage our human capital than we are. So 2 lessons or 2 experiences. One, I happened to have gone to a PME down at SOCOM back in 2012, and the then commander of SOCOM had just put in place their MPOTF program, so their Preservation of the Force and Family program, had just put some money on the table and figured out, hey, where can we go with this? Because we know that human capital, the holistic human performance, is central to our success. And amongst many quotes that he said, that it can't be just about the mission. It has to be about the operator that's executing the mission, right? And so that's the beginning of the journey. Last point. And so kind of carrying that along and seeing all the things that, we do as war fighters in conflict and in combat, even more so at the scale of warfare, the physical, mental, social, spiritual, behavioral aspects of what we bring into that environment have got to be richly supported, honed, trained, educated, managed, all those things. And so one of the first projects that the then Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Berger, asked me to take on with developing the force as part of the force design that he had here in 2019 was to take on this project of holistic human performance. So I worked with the Center for Naval Analysis. We did a big study. We talked about how to put a strategy together and kind of bring all these separate components in those 5 domains together and focus on the human that takes action, takes place, and is part of this warfighting domain. And that's what gets us where we are now.
I want to pick your brain on that point that you made earlier about machines versus manpower, because it's one that we bring up a lot, quite frankly, in different with different guests and in different, I think, forums. And the question I have revolves around the fact that, like, in my day-to-day job, I have to reckon with this reality, which is that the military is really good at understanding red, yellow, green maintenance charts, parts, pieces, machines. But what they're trying to invest in is this human element, like you mentioned. And we see this in contemporary sports science, contemporary physiology. Like, the human being is a very gray and squishy subject. And not to mention, it's also a very resource intensive and expensive thing to maintain and to enhance. And so what I'm curious about is, at your level, when we're talking about return on investment, when we're talking about metrics, when we're talking about resourcing, how do you do that in a culture that is so ingratiated with this idea of parts, pieces, red, yellow, green, and is not really, I guess, warmed up to the fact that the human being is very, very different?
So there's the challenge,
Mhm.
right? Had a conversation just a couple of weeks ago trying to bring this up to the policy level. And that's kind of, so where you sit, where you stand, right? But let me break it down to the lowest level. So let's assume that I'm a squad leader of an infantry squad. What am I responsible for with respect to human performance for that squad? Immediately, as a leader, I'm held accountable if someone becomes a heat case. Sure, the individual has a responsibility to hydrate, right? But at that level, at the squad level, the leader is responsible. So you establish a standard, either through trust or training or repetition, of how to hydrate, right? If I'm on a patrol, I have to ensure, based upon the threat condition, how much rest someone gets. I'm responsible for that. If I fail to do that, then either you get ambushed because nobody's awake, or you're so exhausted over the course of over time because you didn't build a rest plan and schedule inside of it. So at the tactical level, it makes all the sense in the world. I'm going to give a don't drink, don't drive brief on Friday. When someone comes in on Monday with alcohol in their breath, I'm going to make sure they go see a substance abuse counselor. Well, you know what I'm saying? At the tactical level, we never ask this question. But at the strategic and policy level, we're like, we got a bunch of programs. We have everything we need. What we're missing is any of this being a requirement, a policy. So let me kind of bookend that by saying we have eligibility criteria in order to join the U.S. military. Check. So there are human performance standards in order to enter. Mental health standard, physical fitness standard, drug, alcohol abuse. We have all these standards. You can get waivers, but there's a minimum standard you must reach. Right now, only about, 24% of the American population meet the physical fitness standards to join military service. Okay. Obesity being the larger of the number of disqualifiers. Okay. So we have a societal issue. Mental health, etc. So what I'm getting to is we have entry-level criteria, and then after that, a bunch of programs. How do you maintain or increase the performance? And again, we will focus mostly on physical because no military occupation doesn't have a physical demand to it, right? So we kind of hone in on that, but I'm more focused on the spiritual, the social, the behavioral, these aspects, because they contribute to the output, right? The performance standards. Rather than a bunch of programs, how come there aren't equivalent policies that will at least say, hey, services, Department of Defense, you will have a human performance strategy, and your resources will fall within at least these restraints. You can constrain yourself to even more requirements if you want to, but here are things you must maintain. You must maintain through these programs a certain level of mental health. Not zero, because we are humans, right? There must be a minimum of at least continue to achieve the physical entrance requirements, right? Whether it's obesity or heart disease or all the other factors, you must, if you want to get after suicide, have y'all read any of the stuff by Dr. Miller?
Oh yeah.
Lisa, okay. What's she say? 60+% if you are faith-based, spiritual, we like to mix with the words, less propensity for suicide and mental health. If you practice within a group, hello, we are teams in the military, are we not? Okay. 85+% less propensity for mental health, behavioral, suicidal behaviors. What are we talking about? None of those things are requirements. They're offerings. And so your question is about how do you take that human dynamic and put it in a position to make it less about options, but more some requirements. That tactical level gets us there, but at the highest level, we focus on things and not the holistic view of it. That's very wordy, but hopefully you got something out of that.
No, yeah, it's perfect.
So speaking of policy, like I've been in the space long enough and nerdy enough to read like DODI 1010.10. You got CJ CSI 3405.1. You got a few documents that are out there. They have been updated in recent years, and they all lay out a framework. But as far as I can tell, they kind of chop up responsibility. A lot of it goes to Undersecretary of Defense Personnel and Readiness. A lot of it goes to Assistant Secretary of Defense Health Affairs. A lot of it recently seems to fall under DHA. And they kind of just tell the services to go make holistic health and fitness happen. Do you think we're at the point where it's time for like a clear DoD proponent for total force fitness? And then if so, or if we're going to craft the policy you're discussing here, how does the DoD level, the strategic level, add value without overly constraining the services from adapting to their unique situations and demands?
Yeah, I think so. There's the crux of it, right? There's really the problem to solve. I would offer, and again, I won't recite paragraph, line, and verse here, but DoD level policies in most cases don't say you will. They say you may, you should, you can, etc. That's one version of it. My observation, or our observation, is also that every service is doing something. I would challenge that outside of the actual physical requirements of an individual service, I expect an airman's physical output to be different than a soldier's. I would expect within a service, I'll speak Marine Corps, I may need to have an aviation maintainer have certain physical standards, not just the generalized fitness test, but performance standards, that an infantryman, they might be a little different. They have those individual physical performance standards. We have it by almost every rate, MOS, AFSC that there is in all the services. But overall, generalized, holistic human fitness standards, not so much. I would say the human is the same no matter the service. Every other aspect except physical performance standards, they're the same thing. Whether you became a Marine, a soldier, or a sailor, irrelevant. The recruiter got you, or you chose the service that you wanted. Everything but lift an ammo can this many times or do so many push-ups is all the same. So at a policy level, go forth, have a program is one thing, but go forth and have a program that will do these 5 things. Gather data, observe return on investment, have a program that can either individualize or group assessments, all of that, not a requirement. So that's different, right? Going down that line is much different. The last thing I would offer to you is if we want to get after suicide, we will have direct line of funding. We'll have a mandate. You'll have this program. It will have these outputs, but it won't touch the 3 or 4 other overarching human performance requirements within its language and appropriation, right? It isn't just about go to suicide awareness training. It's mental, social, physical, sleep, nutrition, stress, spirituality. That's not what we'll do. We'll focus on that one niche thing. Largely, I would say that a policy can get after what we call non-EAS attrition. It's all those things besides the day your contract ends. The majority, almost every single non-EAS attrition factor, which impacts how many more you have to bring in, recruiting, accessions, how many you can retain, the depth of that talent pool, is based upon human performance standards. But we don't focus a policy that goes after how to reduce non-EAS attrition. If we did, it would be holistic human performance that we would go after to reduce that, right? Again, very broad, but policies are more you will versus you may, you can, or whatever.
So you mentioned in there that every service is doing something, right? And we've seen a ton of different programs. Some services even have multiple programs, like big ones. You talked about POTIF already for SOCOM. Armed Forces Wellness Centers are across the DoD. Human Performance Branch is Marine Corps' thing lately. H2F for the Army. Air Force has like 3 or 4 that I know of. Which, like from your seat, looking at those things happening across the services, what are you seeing that's working well? And where do you see the services still trying to figure some of this stuff out?
I'll always lean towards POTIF, not because I think SOCOM has a better program. They're the ones that have been doing it the longest. Therefore, they have the most data, and we can answer the return on investment questions, right? But even they, when they testify, they're getting hammered. Hey, why are you spending all this money on this? Right? Because we're humans, right? How can you show in a data-driven world that by having this, what someone would say is expensive, but I don't know the cost of human being performance, right? How can you spend so much on this? What's the return on investment? Show us the results, right? I think that's the challenge. I also think that with all the services, and again, I'll talk about my own service because I spent, a good period of time in this space with the Marine Corps, especially having done a study on it, and the recommendations that were in that study. It answers your question. The number one recommendation from the study that we did in the Marine Corps, human performance, was there must be an entity that is responsible for establishing the standard, receiving the resources, issuing out the resources, and it must be done across the entire service, not in some parts where we think it's more applicable, right? That doesn't exist at the department level. It doesn't exist at any service level because of a couple of reasons. Resources being the constraint, right? But what if we took all of the resources poured into all of the human performance programs, right? We probably have a lot of more resources than we would give ourselves credit for. But in order to focus them on 5 or 6 major, 8 areas, 6, whatever the number of areas we want to focus on, had some real outputs to it, right? We probably would not be any less resourced. We probably could sure reduce a lot of stuff that we're doing, compact that, focus on prime areas, and be a lot better off than we are. That's the kind of policy thoughts I think we should go after.
What does that look like? I guess my question is like, what does that look like tangibly? Because again, something that we've iterated on in the past is this idea of people first. And we do still get a lot of, I guess, noise, and I know you do too, in terms of the quality of barracks, pay discrepancies, access to different programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I know, generally speaking, most people have no idea how budgets work and how allocating funding works. But for us, I think what it boils down to is like, okay, people first, investing in kind of that grassroots, the priority, the soldier, whatever branch. Like tangibly, what does that look like to direct those resources on that individual so that they then can, I suppose, increase their outcome exponentially in some sense, because you're now directing the spotlight at the person instead of the programs surrounding the person.
Yeah. I think that might be the toughest part because that's the buy-in piece, right? One, those that are going to develop and manage such a policy, buy-in from the individuals, right, who are being told you'll take part in this, right? And then everybody else in between has to manage all that and resource it and do all these sort of things. What's interesting in that conversation is this. Either one of y'all had to go to a doctor or anything? Had to go through a recovery program?
Oh yeah.
Okay, was it optional or not?
Since I was active duty for most of the things I went through medical stuff
Yeah.
for, I think that's an interesting conversation because pretty mandatory, but how long you stick with it starts to get into personal choice. And
Yeah,
I
okay.
was going to say, as a
And so,
civilian, it's totally optional.
right. And so if you did all the things to done the preventative portion of that, okay, so now we're in a different space, right? So what we have a tendency to do is, hey, run. Okay. How do you run? Do the physiology of that. How much is enough? How much is too much? How do you increase your bone density, right, in order to take that impact over and over again? Talk to me about sleep and sleep deprivation. How, when you're going to sit in front of a bunch of screens all day long, what's the impact of how much your nutrition, being sedentary, to stand up, sit down? I think when we talk about that, it is absolutely mushy, like you described. However, there are some facts, right? There are facts that we know. If you want to reduce obesity, serve different types of food at the chow hall. Remove immediately all fast food restaurants from all installations.
Yes, thank you for saying that.
Right? Immediately address and educate the force that though you may not like it, the contract at the dining facility is based upon well-balanced, nutritious, high macro, right? It's the contract we have with them. So that's what they produce. Unfortunately, it doesn't compete with a cheeseburger. So therefore, right, there's things that we can do. And I think you guys know this. If you go into like a soft installation, I've been to a couple of them, none of that stuff exists there because the primacy of the performance of that individual, not just physically, but every decision and thing that they do, the investment in that individual is so great, they can't afford to take exception in these other areas within their span of control, right? As an organization. I think that the investment that we place in training, education, development, experience, the deployments, all that stuff that we have for our service members, I don't care what their MOS is, we can educate the force back to a position of just thinking about nutrition differently as one of many things, and then, right, eliminate all the challenges to that. I've been doing this for a long time. I can remember being on bases and installations that didn't have, like, you went to the chow hall, you went to the dining facility. That's where you ate. Sometimes too many options is not good for our performance. And that's one of many things you're talking about, though. But why is going to see the substance abuse counselor an option only after you get a DUI? I'm not talking about quarterly training and slideshow presentations, but when you normalize it, right, then it's a sort of a different acculturation at that point. In other words, the culture's got to change if the policy facilitates the culture changing.
so you've opened up one of our favorite cans of worms. I don't think it was a topic we planned on talking about in this episode, but we gotta chase it now that you've brought it up.
Our population would be mad at us if we didn't.
So I'll ask a very direct question. Every on-base fast food option is an AAFES franchise. The AAFES board of directors is made up almost entirely of general officers and senior enlisted leaders from various services. We talk about this issue all the time, but given that leadership is primarily uniformed leaders who care about these issues just like you do, what is stopping us from executing on that problem?
Complicated question, but there's a really simple solution for it. I'm glad you said AAFES. My service doesn't use AAFES, but I
Sure.
see your point.
Next for you guys. Yeah.
Yeah. They all generate NAF funds, non-appropriated funds, and those non-appropriated funds go right back into programs for service members and families and MWR and other things. So the complexity of your question, right, has a very simple answer. Get rid of things that generate NAF funds and turn those things that we see as requirements that we're actually generating funds to do and make them appropriated requirements. That is outside of the total obligation and authority defense budget constraints placed upon the Department of Defense. So if
that's
you
Congress.
Yeah, well, I won't blame it on Congress, but with with almost $1 trillion, you can do a lot of things, right? But can you have softball, soccer, swimming pools, gyms? Can you have that kind of stuff in an appropriated budget? Are those things requirements for the Department of Defense? Are they community health programs? What are they? So you get into all that entire conversation and you end up with a model like we have right now, generate money for things we want, appropriate things that we're told that we need and that we profess that we need in order to do war fighting and war winning. This is the challenge that we have, right? I think as long as we're going to generate NAF funds, then we're going to see things that get customer throughput up, right? That's usually the things you're talking about.
I mean, I think that gets us into a tough spot, right? And you've already alluded to this in your statement, but if we kind of make a statement about our values in terms of what we categorize as a need to have versus what we categorize as a nice to have. And right now we've categorized things like to include childcare for our service members as like half must have, half nice to have, right? It gets some appropriated funding, but then the rest is dependent on those NAF funds generated through various instrumentalities. And I wonder if it's time to have that conversation about, like, if we care about holistic human performance, if we care about taking care of the service member in all of these different domains, do we need to reevaluate what is appropriated versus not appropriated, because we don't consider this optional anymore. We consider this foundational to the readiness of the force.
Yeah, so a great question. Again, I don't want to keep leaning on my previous experience, but yeah, so we did a couple of things about a year and a half, about 2 years ago in the Marine Corps when I was a sergeant major of the Marine Corps, and asked that very question, right? So of those types of programs, we went out to the entire service and we said, okay, hey, you service, tell the headquarters what you think are requirements and what are not. So we got great feedback from across the entire service. Hey, we find these things as priorities. It won't surprise you that the human performance things that are inside that sort of community service program model that the Marine Corps has were at the top of the list, followed by, things like libraries, youth sports. They came in there, right? But there was a whole longer list of things we don't need to do anymore. Right. And so the service members and their families probably can tell you what those things are. But the challenge is going to be okay, let's say we cut all of these things and put this funding, no matter how you get it, appropriate or not, into the things that we find are their priorities. What's on this list might surprise you. Some things we are required to have. But what happens when someone has a voice in that one thing, that one program, that one entity was helping that individual or that family, then you can't get rid of it. If you want a good example, and this is saying something good by making it sound like a backhanded compliment, go on Military One Source and look at all of the hundreds of phenomenal resourced programs to get after what we're talking about and many other things. There are so many, there's so much out there to help people, whether it's human performance or other things going on, MWR and this sort of thing. The question we should ask is, are there too many options so that we can take the same amount of resources and put into fewer options? That's the question. And where human performance comes into play, it's exactly the same thing. All of the services are doing many things. How many of the things the services are doing should be the same things? And how can you now take the resources and focus them on those fewer things and still give the services what they need, which is flexibility, right? To do what's more important to their service. If I'm in the Marine Corps, I have to have swimming pools. I got to have them. It's Marine, right? If I'm in the Air Force, I may find pools are more recreational than they are performance required. Okay. I can't afford the Marine Corps to do pools and all the same stuff the Air Force does and have some of the stuff the Army. I'm being specific for that service, but you see my point, right? What would you do? Could you use the resources differently? Mental health, all the same. We focus a lot more on how to destigmatize mental health than focusing on how to prevent, manage, right, and help people. Stigma is a bad thing, but the system's overwhelmed. Interesting. How would you get after mental health? Talk about and resource and focus on things, not just mental health provider, right? That's holistic.
I guess, and not to make this an ongoing AAFES conversation, but to sort of put a bow on it, I'm interested in your thoughts on this conundrum that we've brought up a couple of times, which is to say that I'll use H2F as an example because it's the one that we're most familiar with, but a lot of resourcing is being put towards that program. And interestingly, it's almost competing with some of those things that we just mentioned, some of those AAFES type, fast food, again, as just a clear example. And so we're putting money and manpower towards trying to create a more resilient warfighter across all the branches. And we're preaching all of these behavioral change, mechanisms, but we're also we're effectively competing against an entity that is literally right down the road from most of these soldiers, sailors, Marines.
Yeah.
Is that dichotomy as clear cut as I see it and as we see it, or is there more nuance to it? And maybe the question here is do you see a world where that changes?
I see a world where it changes, but it's not going to change overnight, right? Because something has to replace two things: needs of the services, which, by the way, this will include families, right? And what's going to replace that funding line? Because at the end of the day, it's making money, and that money is going back into programs. Sometimes they compete with the very nature of how the funding got there. So I can't hold AAFES. I'm not going to say anything negative about AAFES how we got here, because ultimately we are where we are. But over time, what's going to replace, you name the worst fast food restaurant on the planet, what's going to replace that? Okay, you have to have a source that can provide food. It can be more nutritional. Will it produce enough revenue to be viable, or it's going to leave, right? Because as a company, it's not going to make anything, right? Can you change the contracts of the dining facilities to make them more usable, right? Make them more applicable to the modern way in which we provide food, or you do carry outs? Can you have how do you do all that? Is that a negotiation in the contract so it doesn't get more expensive? Ultimately it's about resourcing, right? How do you use those resources and educate the force? Have the human performance centers where people go and they learn about proper nutrition, and guilt them into not eating a cheeseburger after an hour and a half long workout. And you know what I'm saying? Come on, so we all do not a lot of cheeseburgers you guys eat. I can tell by looking at you. You know what I mean?
I had cake today, so don't push too hard.
Hey, what's the Weeder principle? Nothing in excess is good for you. Okay.
That's fair.
Everything not in excess is good for you. But at the end of the day, yes, it's going to take time and a hell of a lot better management of the resources. So ultimately, this is why a policy focused on a strategy that constrains, maybe restraint is a better word, what we're focused on in human performance, focus the resourcing on these primary aspects, and the rest of what's left over at that point, we can do other things with. But right now, it's a free-for-all.
Mhm.
With all the greatness that military one source is, it's a lot. It's all being resourced somehow, right?
Mhm.
Spreading that peanut butter, not doing so well, maybe in some programs.
So pivoting somewhat here, I don't think we want to beat the non-appropriated fund horse too hard. We've had episodes on that already. But your congressional quality of life hearing comments, I picked up on one thing in particular, and that was that you mentioned leveraging total force fitness, leveraging military human performance as a way of preparing potential recruits for service. And that was the first time I had heard about somebody talking about the application of total force fitness pre-accessions to
Yeah.
influence the pool of eligible qualified applicants who would want to be in the military. And I wonder how you envision that happening. Is that something separate from each of the services programs, or are you looking for human performance teams that are embedded in units to also be getting like off base and engaging with the local community? What does that look like to you?
Completely visionary. So don't take what I'm getting ready to say out of context, right? But ultimately, we're an all volunteer force. We have eligibility criteria in order to join the all volunteer force, whether we ever went to conscription or selective service in a time of war, different conversation. But let's just focus on the now. Here's some facts. 23% of our nation's eligible population qualify for military service. Only 23%. The other 70, what is that? 77% don't even qualify. Of that, 24% can't meet the minimum physical fitness standards. Harvard found that spirituality increases healthy lifestyles. There is 12.5% of the eligible population that have mental health issues. This is coming into the service at this point. Obesity is the number one, the study that I saw, inhibiting factor for someone who's eligible, who has desire but not qualified, right? So all of these standards are societal issues, first of all. Number one, immediately start having discussions with the Department of Education about how we view, right, fitness as a nation, not just as a national security thing, but look at the reduced cost of medical care if we just teach people how to eat and exercise appropriately as part of our development in our education system. Numero uno. If we took the occupational health assessments that the Department of Labor puts out, right, to keep businesses from having a bunch of insurance claims, right, and keep them safe and not harming humans in their workspaces, apply those things in society, then the quality goes up. Now directly to this human performance conversation. That's going to take time. So you have what you have now. What do recruiters have either in the delayed entry program? The Army's got a program now, like a pre-boot camp thing that they're doing, and not focusing on just what's the rank structure of a soldier or the Army. They're also focusing on how to manage stress, keeping financial fitness, right? Making sure you understand mental health fitness, making sure you understand self-care, understand how to exercise appropriately, make sure that you eat right. They're doing this already. That's all holistic human performance. Maybe in the professionalized recruiting forces, they also go out and when they get someone in their delayed entry program, again, once you sign the contract, there's a requirement, right? Again, it's a very visionary model, but how do you the output of recruit training and the output of what the services have to do and performance standards, not just the physical, but win wars, doesn't change because what's coming in is different. So how fast can you get everyone up to the right level holistically, sustain, maintain, or improve that over time is constrained by what comes in the front door day one. Maybe reaching out a little bit sooner just from what the department can control, knowing you have to have this interaction with other department agencies, right, as a societal issue, okay? It's a different conversation to have. That's very visionary, but that is national security at its best.
I'm going to try and turn what I'm about to say into a question, but we're going to ramble for a second here. And for background, framed behind me on the wall is John F. Kennedy's 1960 article, The Soft American. And it's actually part of how Drew and I met each other. He had it framed in his office and we started talking about it. And JFK observed a number of issues in 1960, all of which have only gotten worse since then. Our efforts to address them maybe slowed down the progress at best, but we certainly have not turned that curve around in any way. And I appreciated some of the comments from the article, like the battles of tomorrow are won on the playgrounds and the baseball fields and the corner lots of today, and having like healthy, physically active kids is both a national security issue and a public health issue for this country. How do we, like, I hear the comments you've made, I hear them constantly in military and veteran circles, but we seem like we're struggling to move that conversation like beyond the national security sector and into a real conversation about public health, about national policy, and like get it from military leaders into the hands of elected leaders and leaders in education and cultural influencers and things like that at the highest level. How do we make that conversation happen more broadly? Because you said it at the start. You said this is a societal level issue and we're only dealing with our subset of it in the military.
Yeah. So ultimately, this is the harder nut to crack, right? But what's the best way to say this without getting outside my box? One department in our government is going to have to take the lead in this space, right? Acutely, we see the challenge in the Department of Defense, probably unlike the rest of the interagency does. In other words, it's not just a challenge to propensity, those who want a desire to serve their nation. It's, okay, if you were propensed, would you be qualified? Different conversation, right? And rather than say, well, if you're propensed, we'll just figure the ways to get you qualified, or kind of like waive this or waive that. That's a hole that doesn't necessarily make the Department of the Defense better. But there have been times historically where we've had to do that, right? This isn't about lowering standards, but do you continue to maintain the highest standard possible, or do you digress to a still qualified standard, but it's not as high as you maybe should need to get, right? Ultimately, this leads us to, I think, one of the departments has to take the lead. I'm an advocate and have been working diligently, I mean, almost personally here to try to bring together. In fact, we just had a conversation today in our office about putting together with the Department of Defense. I guess has to be the one to lead because we can see this right now, bringing in DOE, bringing in DOL, bringing in the VA. You want to reduce VA cost? Bring somebody in out of society and maintain their performance throughout their career and then into the VA system. You know, that makes sense. Bring in the President's Council on Health. You know, bring all these folks together that are focused on this and say, look, here's where we're at. It is not bad to go outside and play. Right? Yes, we are more digital, technological, screens and devices are our way, but you know what? Get outside. Right? It's okay to achieve. It's okay to be average. Let's talk about the psyche for a minute. Average is actually pretty good. Better than below average, right? Focus on not having to make the $1 million, be on the TV. How do you survive and be successful? This was President Kennedy's point. We put it in an op-ed a minute ago. Just ask not what your country can do for you. Okay. President Reagan had a good one too. If not who, if not you, then who, right? So how do you start to get the society to turn and be competitive? Have a win attitude, not just in physical fitness, but have a win today attitude. That's spirituality now, right? That's your purpose for being, you know, turning that ship. It's taking a long time to get here. I suspect it'll take a long time to turn it around, but until you have a pivot point and can come to some sort of agreement, then we're there. Have you ever read anything put out by the President's Council on Fitness?
I think we're up to 3 President's Council guests on the pod so far.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What have you learned? I want to ask you to be, attributable here, but they don't all see that mission statement as the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. And I think more broadly on that too, they are empowered to go out and talk about it, but they're not a policy-making body. They're not really funded, and it heavily depends on what the priorities of the administration at that particular time are, and there's usually something more pressing.
Now, I'll never get into the administration side of it, but let's just assume everybody that has that microphone may want to solve America's fitness and health issues from completely opposite spectrums on what real human performance is about. All humans are genetically, chemically the same. So I'll just leave it at that.
What do you, I guess, to dive a little deeper into the point you were making previously, like from where you sit and with your experience, you talked about a pivot point. Like in your mind, what stone or stones have we left unturned since President Kennedy, forever ago, kind of brought this to the attention? Like, because you mentioned we've been talking about this for a really long time, and the ship is very slowly maybe turning. But like, what are some areas that you think we could double down on just societally?
Yeah, this is a tough space because it can be sensitive to some folks. So I'm gonna think of a creative way to say it without acting like I'm trying to dodge the question. As a nation, we are focused on many other things other than our national preservation.
Mm.
And so what we may miss is that our I'm right to national defense, because I got to stay within the space that I can talk within, right? Our adversaries are in it for the win. Their assumption is not that they will lose, that if they continue to improve across all these domains, across all the technological advancement that they can, they will be in a position to literally change, right, the world order, change all the rules to their benefit, become hegemonies. At least one wants to be the only hegemony. I think some of their newest friends should probably pay attention to what they've been writing about. And that would not be to the benefit of us and our free partners and allies on the planet, right? And they're going to do that first and foremost through technology, and secondly, like the nature of war tells us, through human capital, right? Whether that's in mass or whether that's through, quite frankly, one of our adversaries is doing genetic engineering right now of their soldiers. Fact. Matter of fact, a former national security advisor, I believe it was, made that statement about 6 years ago. Wonder how far along they've gotten in the last 6 years, our adversary. And so from a national defense, from a nationalism, our flag, the red, white, and blue, how we defend that is not just something that the military does. As a whole of society, right, issue. Nationalism not being a bad thing to say. It's about protecting rights and freedoms. And we can't do that with an unhealthy, unfit, constantly told through certain forms of media that everything here is bad. It's all negative, 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 negative. So how do you reverse that? Start talking about the positive a little bit more, right? I mean, this is very like touchy-feely stuff. But what's the psyche of our nation right now? And why would I need to be socially, behaviorally, morally, mentally, physically, fit? Why? I got my stuff I get in 24 hours. I drive my thing. I get my stuff. I complain when somebody else has more than I do. I mean, all of that's not good for our national existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not the answer you were looking for, but the problem is big. Right.
For sure. And I mean, it's one of those questions where if you had the answer, obviously we'd probably all three of us be in a different place. So
I'll challenge that from one perspective. I
please.
think everyone knows that's the problem, but has no energy to do the probably few things it's going to take, or it can take to move that needle back in the right direction. America is a good country. Period. How does that affect human performance? Right? Just psychologically. Some social media is bad for your mental health. Some is not. Eat well. I like Chick-fil-A. I could drive around circles in that thing all day long. Too much of it's not good for you. You know what I mean? And it can't be your only primary food source and say I'm food insecure at the same time.
So we'll steer this in a specifically national defense direction, keep you in the lane you're comfortable talking about. And I hear from reliable sources that you have a lot of thoughts on the state of the all-volunteer force. We're not too far past the 50-year anniversary of the all-volunteer force, the Gates Commission and all the documents that led to that happening. And there's been a ton of dialogue about like what it's done in terms of the civil military divide. We like the op tempo that our forces have been dealing with for the last couple decades and how that hasn't been felt by the rest of society. And I'm just curious about, you've touched on all volunteer force a few times here. You've touched on recruiting issues a couple times here. What do you think the state of the all volunteer force is today? And how do you think that's influencing both like America's perception of national defense, but also just the culture and the level of performance inside the military?
Well, first of all, since you mentioned the Gates Commission, I think we would right now state that every one of the challenges, I think there were like 7 of them, maybe 8, really big rocks. We see a lot of those coming to fruition, right? Let me focus in the area that I speak on the most. And so we get to all volunteer force. Is a 30% pay raise across the force. 30%, like day one of all volunteer force. And a couple of our focus areas. Gates says, or the all volunteer force is founded in equitable housing, right? If you join the military, you should have a safe, secure place to live, domicile, whether that's living out in town, whether it's on installation in the barracks or in family housing. Access to equitable health care. Keyword here is equitable, right? If you go to Los Angeles and make $1 million, you're going to get better health care than somebody that doesn't make $1 million. But equitable, consistent health care to ensure the force can go fight, right? Dedicated retirement plan. So you keep talent in the force over time, right? So there's a golden egg at the end. If you keep that talent and experience, you'll have a better force, more professional force. Quality of life, but not in terms that we talk about now, like what's my work-life balance? Professionalized force, right, will have better work-life balance than a conscripted force because you're in it for a little while and you're gone. How you make it a lifestyle, a career. And then a couple other factors that we could talk about, but pay being one of those things. I mentioned the pay raise in the beginning, but all these compensations in kind, access to commissaries and gyms and healthcare, all that kind of stuff competes with the amount of pay someone gets because you get a lot of good benefit from serving in the uniform, right? So that value proposition of leaving a job out in society, right? In joining the military for national defense, protect the freedoms of our nation. I'll take some risk and some sacrifice in my life personally to do that because I have all these things, pay, and some other stuff that make this a viable career for national defense. Are any of those things eroding? Well, yeah, probably, right? Lack of investment in some of those things. Other challenges, aircraft carriers cost more than they did in 1973, right? So things are more expensive. They take longer. Technology is very expensive. Keeping pace with your adversary, challenging. But at the end of the day, what's that mean to the individual service member in the all-volunteer force? We are still the best military on the planet. And I could be parochial in saying that, being a U.S. military service member, but still, people look to us as how to do it right, especially the investment we put in our non-commissioned officer corps, which allows our officers to do even better jobs within their authorities of what we ask our officers to do. I don't play the compete game, right? Because otherwise, the system we have would not work. The professionalization that we have, I often joke, I hope today's the day because today we'll win. We're just going to maintain that advantage, right? I think how we look at our last recent conflicts, not wars, because the last time we fought a war was World War II, according to a declaration of war, turned out pretty good, right? Everything after that's a difference in policy, but the force has never failed in a mission it was tasked with. I haven't lost a firefight in 36 years of wearing a uniform. I don't recall anybody that has. Therefore, the ability of the force to fight and win is not in question, right? So I have no doubt in that. What's the future of the all-volunteer force? There is a detachment from society. Gates said that if we have more and more of a professional force, it'll eventually become detached from society and fewer will serve. That's true. But what I think the challenge he did not realize is there was an assumption that there would be enough to be qualified in the first place. That larger societal issue we talked about, the assumption at the time was most people are healthy and fit, can meet their standards to join service, right? That's how come you can have a draft. But like we were having during the 1960s till we ended it. That's gone. So quality, right, and quantity are off. And then there's propensity, which is that desire to want to serve. I've come full circle on propensity just for the audience. For a long time, we had this discussion about no one wants to serve in the military because it's this enclosed thing and it's this pole mill separation. I've been hearing more and more as I get out to recruiting stations, especially in my time in my last role as a sergeant major in the Marine Corps, being really heavily invested in the recruiting environment there, asking the question, hey, why aren't you joining the military? It isn't because I don't want to. It's because you don't need me right now. Why do you need me right now? We don't have any, there's no bad guys. You don't need me to serve right now. We're not in a war. Nobody's going to combat. And since you don't need me, I won't. But if there's a need, then I may find a desire to serve. That was never covered in Gates, and we have never really gotten after that. But one quick point on that to just prove the point. How much do we hear about the real threat to our nation's existence and society? So I grew up when the Soviet Union was still around. I actually joined the Marine Corps when there was a Soviet Union. It didn't matter what was going on in our nation. We knew exactly who the bad guy was. No question. Who's that now? How do we think about how we portray service in the military in movies? I asked this, but there's a movie about a guy who flew around in an F-14 back in the 1980s. Yeah, at the end of that movie, he was still flying an F-14, so we can't even bring that forward, right? Most of us have PTS, killed the good guy at the end, stole the gold. I mean, even the movies about our service in the last 20 or 30 years, not positive. And then you throw the pole mill thing in there, which may not be as disparate as we think it is, unless it's politicized by media in particular, right? Not a lot of guys in this building that I'm working in right now spend a lot of time worrying about what's going on across the river because we have separate but equal. We're in a different branch. We don't interact with the Congress in that fashion. Therefore, we probably shouldn't highlight the few exceptions to that. Otherwise, it turns into the situation that it is. And I'm being vague in that, but I think we know what I'm talking about. So that whole national perception of serving in the military, most of what Gates thought would be the challenges have come to fruition, but they're a little bit more nuanced maybe over time. I'd focus on those nuances.
Mm-hmm.
So just a fast one, because I think some of the perceptions out there are tough, and we're not trying to turn this podcast into something that's all about like recruiting and the state of military stuff. We're mostly focused on human performance for a reason. But you mentioned perceptions from the movies. There's the idea out there that like most service members come back like maimed or mentally ill or something like that. It is just not consistent with the data at all. But one that's tough is like the persistent message about like military pay is terrible. And there are certain things that we can address and fix, and a conversation is out there happening right now about pay increases for junior enlisted in the military and things like that. But the quadrennial military compensation review happens every 4 years, and if we look at total compensation for almost any demographic in the military compared to a similar demographic in the civilian world, we're actually doing reasonably well. We're not just competitive, but we're outperforming a lot of them, especially when you consider that a lot of allowances are untaxed, that healthcare is completely covered, tuition assistance benefits, all these things. I wonder sometimes why the pay narrative is so powerful when the actual compensation is pretty reasonable. I guess I'm just curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I don't want to get ahead of the QRMC. It's going to be due out with its final sort of results here about another year, 18 months. But to the point, if the cost of living goes up and the quality of compensation in kind, right, that medical care and these, if medical expenses go up, so I don't know if you notice or not, TRICARE pays at the Medicare rate. That's its cap. We can debate whether or not healthy, fit, 20 to like 40-year-olds receive the same amount of care as does someone who's on Medicare. but it doesn't pay for above that, right? So the quality of medical care, right? What do you get out of that, and how much does medical care cost? When you get a $20 minimum wage in some states, sometimes that military pay now, right? You may have a room in the barracks. We just talked about quality of barracks very briefly, right? And investment in them over the course of the last couple of decades. But I still have to go out in town and buy gas. I still have to go buy food. Even in a commissary that may give you a cost offset, which is a benefit of military service, right? The cost of things goes up. If the out-of-pocket costs, right, is always going to be in comparison to the compensation in kind. If these things stay stagnant and provide the same benefit, which they do, which is a good benefit, but the cost of everything else that pay is for goes up, and the pay does not keep pace with it, then you may have a percentage and a scale that makes it look like it's good. But the fact of the matter is, let's take housing. The Department of Defense is only required to house 25% of the military on installation. Married. Single are supposed to mostly be on installations. Okay, I got to pay to live out in town. I get BAH for that. That's a benefit. The gas to get there, the utilities are included, but we know that doesn't keep pace with the BAH rates. That's all out-of-pocket cost. In other words, cost of living does not keep pace with military pay either. We just had 2 large pay raises in the military back to back. Why? Last QRMC said we were good. Right? So I'm not competing with the QRMC, not the point, because they do phenomenal work and they end up with exactly the answer that we need when we take all things into consideration. But I do think when things happen at the national level, whether it's inflation, cost of living, minimum pay raise or minimum pay standards, that competes. That starts to have a different discussion on the pay thing. Unless we invest in the compensation in kind to keep that balance correct. How do we invest in barracks? What is the BAH rates for housing? How does the TRICARE pay rate and accessibility to TRICARE? Because some medical facilities won't take TRICARE. It doesn't pay enough to get the care that they're providing. These things, if they're out of balance, then it comes to out of pocket. So you can invest in one or the other, but you cannot not invest in both. If that makes sense. And there's a reason why we do a QRMC every 4 years to make sure that's in balance.
How do you think that because talking about recruiting and retention, I mean, me as a government civilian, I see a lot of how the corporate world, so to speak, has changed. We'll call it post-COVID. I mean, much more flexibility in the workplace, the ability to be remote, a lot more bargaining power in the hands of the employee versus in the past, the employer having much more of that power. And so I think kind of what I hear amongst my demographic and maybe the demographic a little bit younger than me when it comes to whether or not they should serve, the military model of employment, I guess, if you want to call it that, just seems a little bit outdated when we think about how nimble and lean modern civilian workforces look, again, kind of post-COVID. So maybe this is a question about like a future force or something. We can go anywhere with this, but like, is there a place for a leaner military that has more resources invested in the men and women that do choose to serve, or are we constantly trying to chase a quantity number, so to speak, if that makes sense?
I think theoretically, there's accuracy in what you're saying theoretically.
Mm-hmm.
But 27 months ago, I may have agreed with you a lot more than I could agree with you now.
Fair.
For instance, there is an assumption, and it's probably closer to fact, that the precision and lethality of modern weapon systems over distance is such that the proverbial World War II warfare probably is a thing of the past. It's probably mostly right. However, about 27 months ago, right, 2 nation states went to war with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Number one problem, It did not end overnight. The scope and scale of what's going on right now between Russia and Ukraine tells us a couple of things. Number one, modern precision weapons and lethality did not eliminate protraction from warfare. In fact, this is why we know that warfare is different than maybe our experiences has been, because at the scope and scale of it, it has initiated national industrial bases. Well, War on Terror did not do that, right? The human factors, right? Wounded, lost, scope and scale, much different, more closer to warfare because it is. Because that lethality is now compressed into larger and larger groups and armies, right? Not dense ones, but the scope and scale of that. And so here's one thing we know about warfare. There's a nature to it. There's a character to it. The nature of it doesn't necessarily change. Warfare, conflict, combat, Call of Duty version of warfare, right? Much different than artillery barrages, salvos of long-range missiles, the fight for air dominance and air supremacy, right? Anti-access area denial, right? Forcible entry. This is warfare. And so how the force is deployed, listen, I don't need a telemarketer to do an artillery, right? That in some occupational specialties, there are people who will never go forward deploy. But if our nation has got to prepare for war in order to deter it, we can argue that philosophical point. But we know that an adversary will take the first step when they think they can win. And for nation states, that's generally scope and scale, not just small capabilities, right? Mostly a certain balance there. We have to be prepared to pack our stuff and go forward, because the American way of war is to defend the homeland by not fighting a war at home. So coming to work, doing your job, going to the field, training, that's part of the sacrifice, if we want to call it a sacrifice, of defending that flag. But it comes with that very pay we talked about. It comes with all the compensation in kind, the military lifestyle that our taxpayers pay in order to have a Department of Defense, right? People have to be in submarines under the water. They've got to be on ships they'll be flying an aircraft. They've got to monitor your weather stations, and they've got to monitor battle spaces and control centers. That is different than working for a civilian corporation in America. Unless you're a truck driver, right? You can telework the leadership of a distribution company, but people are still on the road moving stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, we have to remember what our Department of Defense does. The Department of Defense isn't about having a job. It's about defending the United States of America and preventing global warfare and winning it if it occurs. It's not the same as working for
Google.
Yeah. I won't name a corporation, but it's not the same in the scope and scale and aspect of it. However, bringing it back, to human performance, right? Because that's kind of what we're talking about, and it's the force and what we do for the force. Somebody said perception a moment ago. There was a survey done a couple of years ago where Americans believe, the eligible Americans, meaning high school, college students, believe 57% believe if they join the military, they will leave with psychological or emotional issues. That's mostly in the advertising, because 57% of those that leave military service aren't emotionally and psychologically distraught. There are some, and we absolutely should focus on, but that's a human performance thing, right? Another 50% believes they're going to leave with some sort of physical issues, broken. Still, there's no data that supports that, right? But that perception and how it gets out into the American public is detrimental to people wanting to serve, right? And for those who want to serve, if we don't have a holistic approach to being able to, one, assist those who do have emotional and psychological challenges or do have physical challenges, right? The narrative is then that everyone has those problems and the military doesn't take care of you. That might be a very disparate form of the holistic human performance policy and practices that we don't have, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this really is about taking care of people. And if we take care of people and people that work for you, generally speaking, recruiting and retention and performance and winning and setting a standard psychologically to our adversary. You don't want to mess with us. All of that's good. But for me, outside of the technologies and the actual material capabilities, to me, that's all the human. That's all of us that wear the uniform, the living, breathing creatures that we are. That's why holistic human performance and all of this context we just talked about is absolutely so important to us.
So I want to move through the next few questions fast because you've been generous with your time already, and we don't want to keep you past what's been scheduled. But you mentioned the perception from high school age potential recruits about the likelihood of getting physically disabled or having mental health issues because of their service and things like that. And I wonder, and this is a giant rabbit hole that we've spent whole episodes discussing, and there's a conversation about how VA disability works and everything. But do you think those perceptions, not just affecting potential service members, do you think those perceptions also affect current service members? Because I hear like every video I see on social media of a service member doing something even mildly physical, there's a series of comments under it sarcastically saying not service connected, implying that like everything physically you do results in disability. So I wonder if you think those perceptions have infiltrated current service members as well, and do you think that changes how they interface with human performance services and staff?
Yes, because perceptions have a tendency to become realities, right? So my wife is a retired Marine, so we live daily, working with the VA. Let me say this for the VA: they fall under laws, they fall under policies, they fall under things that may constrain where they want to go in many cases. But here's something that is interesting. And again, never being apologetic, there is a turn in some of the methodologies within the VA. Let me give you an example of something. And again, this isn't going to be always be a good story, but let me give you an example. So in a department, the Veterans Administration, that's moved further and further away with its communication commonalities with the Department of Defense, how could an organization that everyone in it will come from another organization and they just use different languages? How is that even possible? That's time. That's different bureaucracies. That's different people that are in charge. That's fewer military personnel serving in their civilian capacity outside of uniform in the VA. What's a Motrin versus an ibuprofen? I mean, that difference in the transfer of medical records alone from active duty or any military service or reserve or what into the VA and rewriting an entire record over again, that's going to cause there to be challenges. There's starting to be more convergence in some of these spaces to make the VA's ability to better support those that are all their customers, all from the DoD, right? Previously, that has diverged for some time. It's starting to converge again. That's going to help a lot of it. Understanding disability is probably more challenging than the tax code. I don't understand it. And I'm someone who's been supposed to be retired now at least 4 times. I keep getting these jobs. So I've been through the process. I understand it. I live with a retiree. Got a lot of friends that are retirees. It is complex and confusing. I think we're going to see some things that are going to make that a little bit clearer to folks that are leaving. But if the entire force does not understand it, if it takes a PhD to understand it, most of us are going to understand it at that level. So how can we make it much more simple to understand that, this is worth this percent and that's worth that percent, and 45,000% disability really means 10% disability? I mean, it's very confusing, right? I will also say if we just listened at TRS and listened to the brief we got and understood how it works, might be a little easier too to understand it, because they tell you you're going to do your math and we're going to do our math and they're not going to match. However, how would you reduce someone's disability leaving the service in the first place? Ultimately, the goal should be not more and more people being provided more and more human performance care in the VA. It's fewer and fewer people needing that care so that the VA can focus on maximizing those that need it, and the other VA programs that are provided, education and housing benefit, a lot of things are the same as the services provide. That's a different way of kind of look at human performance, right? In other words, if I was taken better care of while I was in the service, I wouldn't need as much care once I left it. I'll still need care, right? But that's probably a better model.
So I want to ask this at risk of it being too broad a question, but I'm curious to your thoughts because again, it's something we've mentioned in the past, and you seem well positioned to have an opinion on it. Incentivizing disability, insofar as you mentioned you accumulate XYZ injuries and you get sort of cash upon retirement. One thing we've hypothesized about is, man, could there be a way that you incentivize healthy choices or incentivize performance as you get into retirement? Because at the end of the day, much like the AFES conversation, these embedded human performance programs are competing against a financial incentive for soldiers to not be resilient when they get out. Like they want to get paid for being hurt. And I know that sounds a little bit trite, but what do you think about a system that could in some way incentivize performance, or is that too simple a model?
Well, rarely do I give opinions. I'll give one here. I don't think we can change the entire system by the relatively low percentage of people who will intentionally do things to get themselves a larger disability percentage. I'll say that in open. There's some people out there that may do that intently, but that does not reflect upon the vast majority of folks serve in the military and end up using VA disability benefits. We have to remember there's a whole lot more to the VA than like VA hospitals and disability payments, right? So I think what we have to do is one, ensure that when someone enters military service, it's going along with how do we incentivize someone to be the absolutely best performer holistically? It's like mind, body, spirit, when they are called upon to do that thing for which they enlisted to do. Go to war, go to combat, maybe not that. Fly the aircraft, fix the aircraft, dig the hole, shoot the gun, do the administration, whatever they're in service for. And if we have the right policies and practices there, the incentive, it's all there. There's no requirement to utilize it in order to increase the overall performance. If I come to work on time and do a bunch of work during the day, that's performance met. I disagree with that. Right? And so the incentive should not necessarily be reduce the amount of disability for those who might try to cheat the system. We'll chase that forever, right? Is to ensure that when called upon to do this thing that I have enlisted or commissioned to do at the time and need of me needing to do it, can I do it at my maximum level of performance? And if we can achieve that, then once you leave the uniform, right, your holistic performance, your mind, body, spirit is going to be at a different level, requiring, right, a different level of usage once you get outside of the military and use other benefits and things that are there for you, right? The VA is one of many, but you see my point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
While you're serving, I think it's a requirement for us to ensure you are maximized at your top performing level. There are second and third order effects to that outside of you actually being in the uniform.
So, closing question here, because we're about to run out of time with you. You are the senior non-commissioned officer for the United States military. We know that NCOs own the taking care of our people piece of how the military runs. To bring this all back together from your seat at your level, what is the role of the NCO Corps as we continue to develop embedded military human performance?
Not knowing you're going to ask that question, I think I was going back to that squad leader analogy that I gave you. Right? At that level, not only is that NCO advising and informing people, right, informing their leaders, more senior enlisted and their officers of what the human performance challenges are of their folks, but they're responsible for it. Right? And so I don't want this to get out of context. Whether you're a service chief, the chairman, the secretary of defense, these leaders are absolutely accepting of the responsibility of making sure they take care of their people. I don't want people to get too confused about, the plane or the people. these things are not in competition with each other. They are not. And I can get very emotional about some of the interactions I've had with the most senior leaders and their response to how they literally love the people that wear the uniforms and serve in the Department of Defense. I don't want to mince words here, but what we can do is, and we should do is, take that level of responsibility that we would have at the most tactical level and still have the ability to influence the outcomes the same level we would when we were at that tactical level, right? I'm going to use the word I don't mean me personally, but I want to have the responsibility and the resources to ensure that every single service member has a holistic human performance system that they are required to be invested in. That's the incentive in order to maximize their performance. That's every professional sports team's model. That's every college sports team's model. That's every end state of a human being had to perform a task under stress and duress in the most complicated environments possible. That's ultimately the outcome. So not only the responsibility, but the ability to actually put that into place, affect it, monitor it, and make it persistent. I think the challenge we have is we are trusted to do that now, have tons of resources. We have all the resources that we need. We just need to now find what the right things are that are consistent and maximize those areas in order to do that management, that sustainment, that increasing of performance. That's a different responsibility level.
Well, sorry, Major, I think it's safe to say you are undoubtedly our busiest guest ever. So I want to be the first to thank you for your time. This has been more than we could have asked for. So thank you.
And thanks to you guys for what you're doing. I mean, I didn't know I was ever going to be on a podcast. I've done quite a few of them now. But your all's voice is important. And that communication and that societal and that, we just talk about a lot of things here, right? Why you guys are doing what you do is one thing. How you do it and how you influence that messaging is another, right? And we can never put a positive spin on a bad situation, but I use this analogy a lot, and it's a war fighting one, but you guys will get it and make fun of it if you want to. So I grew up as an infantryman in the Marine Corps. And at one point in time, when we were practicing to fight against the Soviets, we used to take this reinforced infantry rifle company with like aluminum things that float, right? And a 50 caliber machine gun on them and 60 millimeter mortars, 81s if you could get it, and attack this thing called the Soviet Triangle Defense, which it was reinforced with like BMPs and Stagger missiles, anti-tank missiles, and like 82 millimeter mortars, 107 millimeter rockets, and like it was this massive thing, right? And we were trained that if one of us at the end had the proverbial Marine Corps flag and planted it on top of that formation, that was a win. That was a win. You can look at that one way and go, I can't believe we risked all those people and all. That's a win. The positive part of that conversation is not about all the massive death and destruction and all the people that didn't come back home. We won. It's a win. So how we tell the story sometimes is more important than the story we're telling, if that makes any sense at all. So thanks for what you guys do. You do a great job of it. Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Drew. First guest to dial in from the Pentagon Briefing Room. What do you think?
So for people that don't know, on Zoom, when you're hosting the meeting, like if people go in the waiting room, it kind of pops up on the top, like, you know, so-and-so is in the waiting room. Alex is in the waiting room. So we're sitting there and Pentagon Briefing Room is in the waiting room, popped up, and I was like, oh shit. I can tell folks is like, I don't know if I would consider us veteran podcasters, but like we've been doing this for over a year now. And that was the first time that's happened. And it caught me off guard. It's a little intimidating.
That was pretty cool. I appreciated some of his answers. Like he has to do the job, right? He can't make serious statements about things that are in Congress's lane and not his lane and things like that. But he didn't he was less political than I might have expected him to be. He was pretty straight up on most of the answers, was willing to express a personal opinion once or twice. I think he kept it pretty real. And this is clearly kind of a high priority to him, which means it's a relatively high priority at the Pentagon.
Well, and I think too, like, we had made a note to ask him a question towards the end of like, what do people not understand, or what are some misconceptions around decision making at his level? And we didn't ask it explicitly because I think it kind of was just sort of teased out in conversation. I say that because I think he sits in one of those positions where a lot of people on the ground can easily lob like criticism and why aren't you doing this versus that? And I mean, he kind of sits in the room where the decisions are made about, I don't know, Abrams tanks versus another swimming pool on an installation. So like, I hate to break this to people, but like, he's just living in a different world than the rest of us. So it's very easy to sit here and like, we talk about people first all the time, and we talk about fast food on military installations, thinking that, and I'm guilty of this too, thinking that somebody somewhere can just sign a form to fix whatever problem we're looking at. And so hopefully listening to this conversation, people recognize like it's not that easy. And I'm including myself in that because I'm guilty. I do it all the time on this podcast. Like, why the hell can't we just kick fast food? And to his credit, like he actually, we addressed that. We talked about it for longer than I thought we would be able to. Still don't know if we've gotten the right answer, but we got an answer from somebody who is certainly qualified to provide his opinion. So
he did call us out a little bit on not using appropriate joint language there. We've been on our campaign against AFES, which is the Army and Air Force Exchange Service. And that is not very joint of us. It's not AFES if you go on Navy and Marine Corps installations.
We have to broaden our scope.
Yeah.
But no, I think to your point, like, yes, he is an active dude. Like this is his job. So he's not going to come on here and like, you know, dig up a bunch of dirt, so to speak. And we told his team at the beginning, like, we're not investigative journalists. We're not trying to put anybody on the spot, but for sure, probably in my opinion, at least the most interesting, definitely the highest ranking perspective we've ever gotten on the human performance conversation.
And I think it's cool to see it being prioritized at that level. I think it's cool to see that language being used in briefings with Congress. Like you observed, Drew, it's a big ship and big ships turn slowly. And I don't think we've even gotten to like the inflection point on the turning of the ship. I think we're just starting to nudge it that way. And at his level, you have to plan 5-10 years out and things like that. And I'm optimistic after a conversation like that one, that there are people in the right positions that are planning far enough out that we might see some of this take shape in a serious way.
I still think the appropriated and non-appropriated funds conversation that might be like, I think if fast food is the hill that I'm going to die on, that's like the grassy knoll just shy of the hill where I'll probably like tumble down to after I'm dead, and maybe dig into that one a little bit more.
I disagree. I think you think that fast food is the hill you're going to die on, and it's actually a pretty tiny hill in the foothills of the mountain that is the non-appropriated versus appropriated.
Fair enough.
Issue.
Okay, fine. Maybe my geography was off, and maybe you're correct. Like maybe that is the new. Maybe the fast food was a false summit.
Yeah,
and this is like this is the peak, and we're scratching. It's like a lottery. Like we're slowly scratching at it. We're getting the right people. We're having the right conversations, but. Man, talking to him, awesome guest, but there's some stuff that he just can't go into that he keeps him up at night, frustrating him about like, oh, why can't we just do this? So I get it.
I believe it.
But yeah, that was a lot of fun. Never interviewed somebody sitting in the Pentagon Briefing Room, so that's a first. And hopefully you guys enjoyed. See you next week.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsandmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.